Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Tim Bobak from Group IB. I'm joined today by Dmitry Volkov.
Yes, hello everyone.
So Dmitry's our head of threat intelligence. I'm responsible for outreach, threat intelligence globally, talking with our clients. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about everyone's favorite criminal APT group, Cobalt, and some of the attacks that they've been conducting on financial institutions in the past 2 years, and additionally about some of their joint operations with other criminal groups in the financial sector. So just a couple of bits of admin before we start off. About this webinar, we'll email over the recordings. We're going to basically be running a kind of a live Q&A. I'll be checking it as we go through the webinar, and me and Dmitry will try and touch on any questions as they take place. So if anyone has any points, just write it into the question and answer pane and we'll be happy to respond. And we'll kick off. So today's agenda is really just to go over the general attacks that have been taking place by Cobalt in the past 2 years, as I previously mentioned. We'll be looking at the different systems inside of financial institutions, telcos, other organizations that they're using in order to target and steal funds, conduct supply chain attacks, and essentially operate globally for this kind of activity. Additionally, we'll be then looking in a bit more detail around some of their TTP, the instruments that they're using, the malware, their recent activity, and off the back of that, we'll then be touching on some of their more recent sendouts and continued operations following the arrest that took place on March 24th by Europol in Spain that affected some Anunak/Carbonac members who are also in joint operation with Cobalt. So that's going to be the overview of today's call. Dmitry, would you like to add anything, or has that pretty much lined everything up so far?
Well, I think it's everything okay.
All right, cool. So in that case, if you're here, you probably know who we are. So I'm not going to dwell on this slide for too long. So Group IB, we do a large amount of incident response. We work with Europol, Interpol, local law enforcement, and we primarily focus on threats to the financial sector, mainly because based where we are in Moscow, we see a large amount of criminal APT out of this area, and so accordingly we investigate it. And a lot of our clients sit in the financial services sector. So we provide a bunch of different solutions, everything from incident response and services like pen testing, all the way through to threat intelligence, our own IDS and sandboxing systems, and other malware detection suites. So this is basically one of the reasons why we have so much data on Cobalt and why we've been able to give a great deal of insight. So moving ahead, what we've done throughout the period since we kind of really got involved into investigating criminal APT that took place in around the 2013 period. Obviously, there were a couple of groups previously before that. I think Cobalt was one of them. Dimitri, is that correct?
Yes, but we didn't do targeted attacks against financial institutions. The primary goal was to steal funds from banking clients.
Exactly. So they were then focusing not on the institutions themselves, but on their external client-facing architecture. So obviously in 2013 that changed. We're involved in doing a lot of incident response around this. We did a number of reports in the period, one with Fox IT as a joint report. It's available online. And that really basically kicked off the cyber criminal groups that we're investigating, that are targeting infrastructure and critical infrastructure inside of financial institutions' networks. So throughout the period since then, we've seen different groups continue to target criminal attacks. One quick point, this is cyber criminal groups that we're monitoring. Obviously, there are other attackers who do target financial institutions such as Lazarus. Our report on Lazarus is available again online. But again, what we're focusing on in this sector is groups that have been able to successfully steal from, in a meaningful way, from financial institutions in the current period. So what we've seen throughout this is that there's been overlaps between each of the different groups that are involved in cyber criminal activities. And we're obviously touching on this with the Anunak/Carbonak attacks that we'll be describing later in this presentation. But Dimitri, it's also worth noting that a number of these groups also overlap in terms of their activity.
Yes, what is interesting is you can see at the moment when one of the groups stop their activity, almost at the same period appears new one. And usually these groups don't have any direct links. Like in this case with Anunak and Korko, we appeared on one of them stopped the activity, next one started the activity targeting financial institutions, but they are not have any overlaps. So I mean, threat actors do not communicate with each other. They do not share any tools and methods how they actually compromising financial institutions. Then Korko group stopped their activity because one of the key members was arrested by Russian law enforcement, and the new group started to conduct similar attacks with name Buchtrap. And of course, Buchtrap don't have any links to Korko and Anunak, so it was completely different group. But later, we started to conduct joint attacks with other group, what was also quite active, targeting customers of different Russian and post-Soviet Union banks, and they started to do joint attacks against financial institutions. It was Lur gang again at the early 2016. Some of Lurk members were arrested, and that's why Buchtrap and Lurk stopped completely their activity. But again, appeared new group with new tools, with changed techniques. But at this point, we believe that Cobalt members have some team members from ex-Buchtrap. So Buchtrap, botnet, and malware actually exist even now, but it is used by other threat actors. But the guys who were specialized on doing targeted attacks now became a member of Cobalt group. But it's, even now, it is active group even after arrest of one of the leaders in Spain. So again, Cobalt is a group that have some links with Buchtrap, and we also found a link with Anunak members because we detected some joint attacks that we did in Russia and probably outside of Russia. But we'll talk about it later. And our group is Money Taker, completely different group, focusing on other regions, have completely different tools and methods how they actually penetrate the bank and how they do lateral movement. And the last one is the most recent cybercriminal group that also doing targeted attacks is Silence. We were quite active at the end of 2017, but we also see that we're doing some attacks even now, but we will do we need some more time to complete our research, and of course we will present our results later to you.
So there, that's the broad overview. Just to add in on Burtrap, I think it's important to note that the access to that particular botnet was sold, as I understand, and then it's currently under use. So it's still used mainly in the former Soviet Union on internet banking systems there for customers of financial institutions. It could go global. There's no reason why it hasn't, but it just seems to be focused on that region. And we're yet to identify any attacks outside of the former Soviet Union. It's probably linked in with money laundering aspects, and we'll be touching on some of these issues throughout this basically presentation and discussing why groups target certain systems that they do. It's worth noting that just jumping back between slides, we've obviously got up to March 2018. This is a slightly old slide. We actually see Silence and Cobalt operating actively at the current time. So as many of you will be aware already, number of phishing emails that were sent out purporting to be from Kaspersky, from also the European Central Bank. And these are now targeting financial institutions globally. We've seen attacks in Japan, Southeast Asia, Australia, South America, Africa, the Middle East, and obviously Europe in relatively recent period. We've also been lucky enough to get from law enforcement logs of some of the servers that have been used for persistence during attacks, and from that we've also been able to confirm that on an ongoing basis they've been targeting global and financial institutions, so everywhere from India all the way through to Switzerland, Germany. So it's very much still a global group, and they're still targeting very broadly in each of their attacks. So this is ongoing despite the arrests that have taken place. So what we'll do now is probably just say, while it is ongoing, let's focus back on previous Cobalt activity and talk a little bit more about what they've been doing historically. So the last confirmed attack that took place by Bertrand was in March of 2016. However, immediately after that, or at the same time, we also identified incidents both in Ukraine and Hong Kong that then obviously have the Cobalt strike indicators, but then also ties into Carbonate Group. So we'll be discussing that in a little bit more on in some of our subsequent slides. But the key point is that after the arrests of Bertrand money laundering, then we began to see attacks that took place against ATMs. So once you eliminate the money laundering aspect from any criminal group, then forces them to look for new ways in order to conduct thefts. Actually muling money out of a financial institution, whether it's through SWIFT, whether it's through central bank systems like ARMKBR, which is the central bank system, transfer system for the Russian Federation, you're still left with the problem of how do I get this money into cash? And so Cobalt obviously looked at this issue. Silence are currently using this method as well and saying, well, let's focus on the closest way of getting cash, which is on the ATM systems. So we then saw logical attacks begin to take place, firstly in Taiwan, in publicized attacks there that took place, but then also across a range of European financial institutions, Russian, Ukrainian, and former Soviet financial institutions from June through to September of 2016. It's worth noting that during this period, there are a number of issues. And the first is that all of the mules kept on getting arrested. So the key point is that when you do conduct these kind of attacks with physical mules in place in the same country as the financial institution that you're targeting, obviously with an ATM logical attack, you're infecting the ATM controller of that particular financial institution. Therefore, by extension, that bank will be, the ATMs will be in the same country. And this means that banks often have very good ties with law enforcement, and you still have the problem of getting all of this cash that you've taken out of ATMs out of the country, getting it back to groups such as Cobalt, and then making sure that then the mules get their money, they don't get arrested, and also the criminal attack group gets their money and doesn't get arrested. So this is a problem that then arose. And so because of a series of arrests that took place, and they're publicly available. I think there's some, if you search BBC Cobalt arrest ATM Taiwan, you'll come up with a number of links around that. So what happened is around September towards the end of September 2016, preparation of attacks took place on card processing in Kazakhstan. Am I correct in thinking, Dimitri, this was on the Way4 system by OpenWay?
Yes, that's right.
So during this particular incident, we conducted incident response at the victim institution. The attack began in September, then using a range of different tools, both for screenshotting, for remote access. The Cobalt group then monitored and also exfiltrated documentation about how the Way4 by OpenWay system functioned for card processing, and essentially learned how the system works, learned how to exploit it, learned how anti-fraud systems integrated into it in order to then be able to conduct the attacks on card processing. Since then, we've seen a large amount of card processing based attacks globally. They are pretty much the sort of the elephant in the room in terms of financial incidents against basically banks at the current time. The reason is anyone with a card processing system can actually relatively easily hide the fact that they've had an incident, whereas on SWIFT, often the sums initially that are stolen are much larger. So you might deal with transfers of 10 million, 100 million, or $1 billion in the case of Bank of Bangladesh. However, it's very easy to then stop those transactions, reclaim the money. This isn't the same issue that you have when you're dealing with, let's say, card processing incidents. And the reason why card processing incidents are also more difficult to investigate from a law enforcement standpoint is that you can conduct, as in the case in Kazakhstan, and then in subsequent cases that we've then monitored, is after gaining access and removing limits to a number of cards that you'll be choosing in a card processing system, you'll then get your money mules to take those cards with no limits on them, so up to $2 million, and they'll have around between 20 to 30 cards as is normal, and they will then use those cards to cash out from various different ATMs worldwide. The problem with arresting the people is that, unlike ATM card attacks, it's taking place in a different country. By the time that law enforcement has been notified and also the attackers have been, detected, CCTV has been monitored, it's already too late to stop the theft or to conduct any kind of meaningful arrests or law enforcement response. And accordingly, this has then driven a large amount more of card processing based incidents because of the success of this particular vector. However, during the period, we then saw Cobalt improve their TTPs. So once they begun to steal from ATMs, they began to then reinvest into some of the tools that they were using. So into ransomware with Petirap. They also then began to develop their own JS backdoors, decoy documents, info stealers, COBIN, reconnaissance droppers, in order to make the procedures of their attacks more efficient. They also began to then use deployments of one-day exploits. So that was with CV 2017-11882 in November of 2017. So we've seen a broad improvement in the TTPs across the entire development of Cobalt. And also we've seen them explore different avenues for stealing funds. And because of these avenues, we're then able to target and identify tool reuse between different criminal groups and attribute Carbonac activity with joint operations in Cobalt. So we'll discuss all of these points in the subsequent slides. What I think would now be meaningful is to talk initially about the Swift attacks and why those were of interest. So I'll hand over to Dimitri now to discuss this.
Thanks, Tim. So one very interesting point that we were able to detect when actually threat actors, Cobalt gang, activated first servers to attack bank in Hong Kong. It happened in March 20 and 28. On these two servers, we actually deployed two tools, two types of different tools. One of them was a Metasploit with Metapredator, which was used only once in attacks related to Cobalt. And the next server was on the next server we deployed Cobalt Strike, what we've seen for the whole lifetime of this specific threat actor. So this bank in Hong Kong used the hosted Alliance platform, which was physical server that was located in the corporate network of a compromised bank. So when the threat actors were able to get, for a little movement process, were able to get access to that server, compromise it, and what actually they did on it. So please take a look on the picture on the left-hand side, and I will try to describe you the whole process. So when they got access to the physical server, we found that this server was running Alliance software. We don't know why, but we were unable to get logins and passwords from legitimate operators. So that's why we started to work with this Alliance software. We didn't modify the software itself, but we put on this server a new command line tool, that is actually with name www.ebserver cmd.exe. This is command line the web server. If you launch it on a different port, in that case it was port 8080, it allows to execute additional web applications. And what is important that this command line web server allows you to launch Java and PHP script. And by default, on Alliance web server, PHP was not supported. So these guys uploaded on the same server malicious file, actually static PHP, and the main purpose of this static PHP was to execute JavaScript. It was called by JavaScript. This malicious JavaScript was embedded on the original web server login page. So every time when any of operator logged in into the Alliance software platform that was installed in the bank, only in the bank, this JavaScript was launched on the victim's machine. When this JavaScript called static PHP code that is responsible to write every login, password, and some technical information like local IP address, user agent, timestamp, and so on. So as a result of executing with JavaScript and static PHP, two log files were created on the server, log.txt and ax.txt. Log.txt is a file with logins and passwords and some technical details, and ax.txt, it is almost the same content as in log.txt, but it has only logins and passwords. But again, it's completely almost the same as the previous file. So using this method, we were able to collect logins and passwords of legitimate operators. So now we were able to connect with legitimate accounts on the Allianz web server and to generate transactions. But to hide these transactions and get some time to be able to do money laundering process, we also created a simple tool that we named Swift Log Supersessor. And the main purpose of this tool was to just monitor some folders that were responsible to to store files that were related to incoming and outgoing messages. And this log supersessor was looking in these outgoing messages some tokens that were related to malicious, to fraudulent transactions. After that, we moved files with these transactions to a separate folder. So we didn't delete it from the system, we just move it to another folder. So this is how actually threat actors were trying to hide details of fraudulent transactions and get some time to complete money laundering process. This is actually what happened in Hong Kong. And we believe that this operation was done not only by a Cobalt gang, but they had external support from other threat actors. We don't have strong information who was supporting them at that time, but probably it was Cobalt, it was Anunak, and we found this link later, and we'll describe it on further slides.
And the reason for this was that in all of the subsequent Cobalt incidents, just one of the indicators well, a couple, let's give. The first is that Cobalt were unable in the first period of, let's say, the first 6 or 7 months of their activity to conduct the same quality of attack. And the second point is that in all subsequent Cobalt incidents, we never saw a connection from Metasploit. In this particular incident, Metasploit was used, whereas in all subsequent Cobalt incidents, they have only used Cobalt Strike. So this was obviously a strong indicator that someone else was involved. However, I think it was the Cobalt Strike beacon that was used was identical as in the subsequent Cobalt incident. So we're able to give a strong attribution there to Cobalt.
Regarding strong attribution to Cobalt. So actually in 2016, since the beginning of activity of this group till the middle of 2017, Cobalt group always used Cobalt Strike. It is not unique software, but we used a unique stager or a program, or I would say implant that will download the further malicious payload, and it was unique. And actually, because of this unique stager, we were able to do attribution to Cobalt gang. But again, it was just one incident in Hong Kong. At the same month, the bank was robbed actually on the April 28th. And at the same time, another bank in Ukraine was also robbed using the same scheme. So attacker was able to steal about $10 million. This is what was highlighted by different news titles in 2016. But later, after some court process, it was clear that threat actors were able to send out only about $1 million.
So this is the same issue that we mentioned previously, where the bank's able to then recall some of the money that's transferred through the SWIFT system.
Yes. And please keep in mind that attacks on SWIFT system is one of the most sophisticated type of robbery of financial institution. And this is how actually Cobalt started their activity in 2016. And after the April of 2016, we never saw even attempt to steal funds through a SWIFT system. Even we were able to compromise the bank and get access to ATMs, to card processing system, and of course we were able to get access into SWIFT system, but we never did attempts to use it again to steal funds. It was true till the end of 2017, when we successfully got access to one of the bank in Russia. It was Globex Bank. It's a public case. And using this remote access, we were able also to steal funds via SWIFT transactions, and it was about $6 million.
Yeah, and yeah, we were able to obviously confirm that with the Russian central bank, and also investigate that by looking at some of the logs that were also detected, and then identify additional victims. So going back a little bit, after the initial SWIFT incident, Cobalt at this time was still, based on the incident response that we were conducting, it was quite clear that they were still learning. And also it's quite clear that they also were not able to repeat the attacks that they'd conducted against SWIFT, and also that they had outsourced the ATM malware development that they were then using for the initial attacks. So here we essentially looked at the different functionality after conducting a reverse, and basically the malware is relatively simple, but allowing for cash out from ATMs, specific ATMs, and emptying the cassettes. Dmitry, anything to add on this slide in particular?
Well, the only thing that's also worth to mention, but we developed this tool in 2016 and started to use it only in 2016, and we stopped the activity. I mean, we stopped shift their focus from targeting ATM to card processing in the autumn of 2017. Oh, sorry, it's not 17, 2016. But at the December of 2017, we used it again, and it was the same tool, completely the same tool, compiled a little bit different for new ATM manufacturer, but even names of malicious files that we used to upload on ATM was completely the same in 2017, and if we compare it with cases in 2016. So these guys do not invest a lot into this type of malware. I mean, ATM malware, we don't want to update and enrich new functionality to hide the code, and they're still targeting some more beneficial systems like card processing and SWIFT.
Just while we're kind of here, just take this moment to say, are there any questions so far? Because we haven't had any pop up, and just we can take a minute now. If there are any questions so far, please feel free to write them in the questions pane, and we can then answer any of the questions so far. Rather than doing it all at the end, it may be more relevant to do it now. So just type them in. We'll move on to the next slide, but then we'll catch up on any questions that are then shared now. So after that, once we finish talking about ATM attacks, some of the malware was used. So here's basically an overview of the malware that was used across a number of incidents, both between Taiwan, Europe, Russian Federation. What's interesting here is that the malware has been developed by the same user. It's also interesting to note that the protection mechanisms that have been put in place indicate that the developer of the malware did not want Cobalt Group to use this particular piece of malware sort of independently, and that's accordingly they then developed the check for the launch month of the malware. If it didn't coincide, then error message is then shown, which to the Cobalt attacker would then be, they wouldn't really know what that particular error meant. However, across different incidents, it's essentially showing that it would not function without it being the correct launch month. Then from, I think, was it correct in thinking, was it Jabber logs that were able to detect the Cobalt strike users discussing this, or that the malware developer was not able to, or not wanting to conduct attacks in the Russian Federation?
Well, yes, comparing malware samples is always good to do. and sometimes we have really good results, but I would say the most strongest confirmation comes from an investigation point of view. There was some arrest in Russia when some team members, it's not public cases, were arrested. We of course did support for Russian law enforcement, and this is why we know that and we're able to get some communication log files where we actually discussed how we prepared attack on Taiwan banks, what tools they used, and some messages were also related to the offer of ATM malware. And another case that also allows us to conclude that this malware was used exactly by Cobalt group is actually from case from December of 2017, when we got a copy of C2 server with a lot of screenshots that we did from from compromised networks. And again, with those screenshots, we were able to identify some new victims, how we actually infected the ATMs, and again, what malware we used. And again, it was the same malware as it was in 2016.
Yep. And so obviously there are a number of, through a reverse of this, there are obviously a bunch of different repeats that you can see through here. But I mean, there's no real need to go any deeper. I think it's all fairly self-evident. What we'd like to do is now answer some questions. So, correct. The majority of attacks so far are only relevant to financial companies. However, we will be touching on victims who are targeted on payment gateways for the telco sector. Also a number of supply chain attacks that took place against media companies, service companies, IT integrators. Regarding the geography, we don't see all of the information that is targeting like every single basically geography worldwide. So let's do it by continent. Cobalt segregates their activity through different attacks. So like it was logical, you might see a whole bunch of Southeast Asia based incidents or Middle East based incidents of one set of server infrastructure. Accordingly, we then see different kinds of basically different geographies being targeted of different infrastructure. Because we don't do a huge amount of cybercrime investigation, for example, in Africa, we do have clients in South Africa, it's worth noting, and they benefit from our information on Cobalt. And obviously, South Africa, as many of you will know, has been targeted by Cobalt in recent weeks. However, it's still worth noting that we might not get to see the same degree of, let's say we might not do the same degree of incident response that we would in our core markets, like in Europe, like in former Soviet Union, and similarly, we have good reach into Southeast Asia. So that's why we're seeing what I would say is certain verticals of activity. We do, for example, though, we've seen mail logs, I think, from like Brazil, South America. We've seen attacks in the US via integrators. It's very much been global, but we are only able to monitor a certain amount of the attacks. But then we do see global attacks relatively frequently, like we've been discussing. So, card processing. Card processing is great if you want to steal from a bank. That's the first thing. So it's way easier than stealing from SWIFT. The level of money laundering that you need is significantly less. The risks that your mules carry is significantly less because they don't have to be physically present at the ATM of the victim bank. Money laundering is really easy because you get clean cash. You can use the same card that's had limits removed in the processing system against multiple ATMs. The bank that you're using it against won't necessarily be immediately notified. You can choose countries that have, let's say, less active law enforcement. You can also, especially in areas where there are multiple countries in close geographic proximity, let's say Eastern Europe or the Balkans, for example, you can then very easily move between countries within a couple of hours and cash out from a whole variety of different networks. It's often very difficult for financial institutions to turn off their card processing systems, simply because if they do that, their entire payment infrastructure will go down. So there arise situations where a financial institution will then have to manually stop each of the cards and also then manually remove access from Cobalt Group if they don't want to have a service interruption, which a lot of banks and financial institutions, for them, that's a bigger financial loss and a bigger regulatory risk than actually losing money through a card processing incident. So primarily, we've seen a massive shift towards card processing. MoneyTaker also conducted card processing attacks, and really it is the most efficient way, in our opinion, to steal from a financial institution. The largest reported attack that we have good information about was in Eastern Europe. Well, Central Eastern Europe. It wasn't, say, yes, it's more Central Europe than it is Eastern Europe. And there we did incident response, and for an integrator that was affected in the course of the supply chain attack, the figures that came out of that were approximately 25 million, according to the information that we were shared. That's the largest incident that apparently involved around 100 mules. Normally, the losses are between 1 to 5 million US dollars, depending on the geography. The reason why the 25 million attack took place is because Cobalt fought with the internal security team of the bank for a number of hours, blocking and unblocking cards. Normally, they give up after they've been detected, and they cease the attack. However, in this particular instance, maybe because there were a larger amount of mules, around 100 on the ground, they then continued the attack over a longer period. So essentially what they do is they gain access to the card processing system, and in sort of layman's terms, they remove the limits from a series of cards that they've got access through, either by, for example, cloning a card, buying like track 1, track 2 data, a dump off of a underground forum, cloning the card and then using that with PIN number, one way, or just getting mules to open up bank accounts that are legitimate or with fake ID or however, in a financial institution, and then using the card that they're given and removing the limits on those specific cards. You can remove overdraft limits even for debit cards. So the scope for this is pretty broad. If you do have card processing systems for stuff like virtual debit cards or virtual credit cards, these can also be used, depending on your card processing infrastructure. So the risk of this attack proliferating is quite large, outside of just the traditional financial services and bank issuer environment. Dimitri, anything to add on card processing there? I think we're all good. We've kind of done it to death as of Cobalt. More interestingly, though, we've seen Cobalt span off into attacks against payment gateways. So the first one of these took place in March of 2017 after a number of Russian and Ukrainian e-wallet companies were targeted. In order to conduct these attacks, essentially what Cobalt did was they developed tools that were able to exploit the relatively simple logic of the payment gateways that then allowed them to then steal basically around $2 million per incident. And the key point is that they are the systems that were targeted are payment gateways. So in Russia and the former Soviet Union and a number of emerging markets, in order to facilitate mobile payments or e-wallets, there are these terminals, sort of look like Daleks, that are pretty much everywhere. They're on the streets, they're in the metro, they're in convenience stores, and they can take up to around $300 at the current exchange rate in cash at any one time. And then you can use them in order to pay your electric bill, your internet, your telephone. You can pretty much conduct any transaction off of them that you'd normally be able to do through internet banking. And so there are a number of e-wallet companies and telcos that then operate using these systems. So they're obviously something that people in the former Soviet Union are aware of, and they're also something that's widely used. So how are they exploited? I'll hand over to Dimitri to talk through the particular tools that we used in the incidents that related to payment gateways.
Yes, well, actually the scheme was itself very similar to what we did with other payment systems like SWIFT, for instance, because the logic of this financial software, I mean, as a payment gateway, was quite similar. This software have two queues. One of them is possible for processing incoming messages from terminals, that you can see on the bottom on the right-hand side, and the next queue is also have a logic to process the outgoing messages. So what the attackers did, they of course compromised the company's internal network, were able to get remote access to the isolated server that was used as a payment gateway application, and started to deploy a very simple tool that we named FileLogger.exe. And so the purpose of this tool was actually to track everything that comes into outgoing into the folders with name out and in, responsible for outgoing incoming messages. So this is how we collected information about the format of messaging system and some technical details that were needed them to conduct actually with fraud, like sequence numbers, terminals, identifiers, and so on. So using this tool, we use it as just a reconnaissance module. Later, we uploaded on the server another tool with name ugw.exe, actually what we use to generate fraudulent transactions. And on the next slide, you can see actually how the graphical user interface looks like. It has Russian language interface, but as you can see, we provided this translation for some of most important fields. So the threat actor launched this tool, and he needs to specify phones, and cards and phones will be used as a bank as an account where stolen money will be sent to. We also need to specify initial indicator of this terminal, initial sequence number of the check, and some file extensions in the folder, and actually the amount that we want to send to these specified cards and phones. Then they need just to click on a magic button like generate transactions, and thousands of small files will be generated in the format that this payment gateway is able to process. Actually, we also need to specify, as you can, I hope you can see my mouse pointer here in the bottom of the web interface, a folder with files. This is actually a folder with outgoing messages. So if after this tool generated all these small files and put it into a specified folder, the payment gateway will start to process them as it comes from original terminals. And this is how we're able to generate thousands of transactions because of limits, and the total loss was about $2 million.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting that with these kind of attacks, and we'll discuss the Carbonac crossover, it's much more difficult to mule the money. So when you're dealing with $2 million and you're looking at $300 per transaction, between $200 to $300, it's thousands. So it becomes much more difficult to then move the money, to coordinate the theft, to move it from different, for example, mobile phones that you've been putting the money onto, or to virtual credit cards, or onto credit cards. And accordingly, it's actually a more complex attack than some of the muling methodologies that we've seen from ATM and card processing. It's also worth noting that with this increased complexity, we also noticed that there was a definite presence of Carbonac/Anunak group.
Well, it was the second episode with other similar company. Actually, we did the same. We compromised internal network, get access to payment gateway, use the other scripts that automate the process. And when it came to doing incident response, we found that we didn't stop actually the activity in the internal network. And even after the company was successfully robbed, we found that some new actions were taken by the same cyber criminals. Actually, we found new servers that were used by development team, and they installed 2 SSH backdoors on them. when we started to analyze these SSH backdoors, we noticed that we already seen it before, and actually the incident where we found it first, it was incident with a similar company that was that happened in 2014, and that attack was actually done by Anunak, Carbona gang in Russia. So actually, Anunak gang were the first group that started to conduct such type of attacks. They were quite successful in that time, I mean 4 years ago, and now this activity was done by a Cobalt gang. Again, so the SSH backdoor itself was identical. We had identical, as I say, private and public keys, and what is most interesting that even C2 server that was used on one of compromised server with SSH backdoor was the same that was seen in 2014, and this SSH in this C2 server was actually mentioned in our report that we published in 2014, and it was with name hagaipipka.net. As you can see, the registration date of this domain was in 2014 and expiration date in 2018. So these guys continue to reactivate this domain name NU every year, and actually IP address for this domain name was not changed even since that time. So it's again, it's the same. When on the next server was the same backdoor, but it was configured to communicate with another host that was available by domain name javacdnupdate.com. It was again registered in October, so after the company was robbed, but again in the same company that was robbed. And this SSH backdoor pointed to another IP address. So the first version that we thought about was actually guys from Cobalt gang sold the remote access to other group, and they started to do further lateral movement and research in the corporate network. But we also noticed that Cobalt Strike C2 servers was actually located in the same subnets where SSH backdoors were actually deployed. So as you can see, the subnets are completely the same before to host SSH backdoor and actually Cobalt Strike C2 servers. But actually highlights to us that this was not these C2 servers was not managed not just by two separate groups, but they were a part of the same ongoing campaign.
So while we're on this slide, are there any questions? We'll jump forward, but I'm just going to have a quick look to see if there are any more points that are worth discussing. We've discussed, obviously, Africa, yeah. No, I think we're all good. But yeah, feel free to keep asking us questions. We'll then respond as best we can. Okay, so what else have Cobalt been doing outside of victim networks? Because we've discussed some of the systems now that they've been attacking, but it's also worth noting that they really focused on conducting supply chain attacks, and they've been mobile in terms of what they do. So sometimes they go direct, sometimes they conduct attacks on the supply chain, sometimes they use IT integrators in order to get remote access into victim networks, sometimes they use the access that they have and through the supply chain on a very limited basis. So they remain flexible. However, the key point is that after they gain access to an IT integrator, a media company, or pretty much an ATM servicing company, they've conducted a range of different victim attacks throughout the period. The majority of the time, they only use this access in order to enrich the level of emails that they're collecting from a victim institution. So they might, for example, target an IT integrator and then exfiltrate all of the email addresses from their mail servers, or they might then use that mail server access in order to send targeted phishing to certain individuals in a financial institution. However, the key point is that a lot of the time there's been unused potential. So they've never, for example, used, let's say, software or software updates, or that we're aware of, in order to conduct infections. We haven't seen any watering hole attacks or other capabilities that have been used in the past by other threat actor groups in the let's say financially motivated cybercrime sector. So there's actually been while there's been a relatively large amount of supply chain attacks, Cobalt still prefer to send out huge amount of emails to a very large audience in order to then successfully compromise bank networks. And the way that they're doing this is through spear phishing. In this, they're using actually and have used a number of different tools. Dimitri, I think maybe got 4 or 5 slides left, but with regard to the technical aspects, I'll hand over for some of the spear phishing and also how they're organizing some of the droppers and recon modules.
Yes, so these guys have really strong habits, and we don't like to change a lot in terms of what we are doing. So even since 2016 till even present time, we use the same tool to send spear phishing emails. And for this purpose, we use a tool developed by a Russian developer. It's a legitimate tool with name Alexis Mailer, or it also has the name iPosylka, which is more relevant to Russian name. And we not prepare very well. We didn't prepare very well actually the spear phishing mail service. So, for instance, we start to configure sender policy framework and to digitally sign messages to be sent from this service only since autumn of 2017. Before that time, we just created the new domain name, very similar to some financial organizations or some security companies, and when used this server without SPF and the KIM to send thousands of messages across the globe. In attachment, we use doc, XLS, FTF, and sometimes we send executables like files with extension .exe, .scr, and sometimes we were successfully delivered even to the corporate network. To bypass some simple security measures, we also put these executables in archive with passwords and even without passwords. And only in December of 2017, we started to send spear phishing without attachments, but with a link that actually leads to malicious Java applet that then will download the malicious payload. To create these malicious attachments like Office document files, we use well-known exploit builders. One of them is actually Anunak exploit builder, Microsoft Word intruder, developed by the guy with nickname Object, and the last one that we started to use since the end of 2017, it was actually missed on this slide, is a threat kit
by Mr. Base.
Yes, but again, it's well-known exploit builders, so we do not develop their own exploits. We do not use 0 days. They do not use some sophisticated methods of hiding their malicious attachment in some new containers. So everything is simple, but actually this is what gave them sometimes benefits when attacking simple, I would say non-IT security personnel in the corporate network. Please go to the next slide. Yes, and this is actually another slide that shows how they changed their tactics in the middle of 2017. Till that time, we never used decoy documents. So actually, the spear phishing mails was a very poor quality. I would say we never used a nice body of a mail. We never used well-written signatures to emails.
Sometimes they don't even bother with the right language. They targeted Spain for a while and just sent them Russian language fish.
Yes, we not really care about the quality of spear phishing, but only in the May of 2017 we started to use sometimes decoy documents that were well prepared. So we believe that we actually were able to collect such documents from compromised network and then use it in some further attacks. But now we see, now in the recent spear phishing campaign on behalf of Kaspersky Labs, for instance, we're using really well prepared messages. But in this case, we also do a lot of mistakes. So one of them actually we mistyped the name of sender email Another actual mistake that we did in the last spear phishing campaign, we forgot to configure properly SPF records from a server that we used to send spear phishing. And so these guys, in terms of sending malicious emails, they do not pay a lot of attention on how actually, what is the quality of their messaging.
The irony is that it still works, so they've got no real incentive. And in fact, to some degree, it also operates as like a, how should I put it, like a self-cleaning system, in that if you can get into a financial institution with a phish that's really low quality, then you're probably not going to get caught by their SOC or their security team either. So there's an argument that actually doing that way is more efficient.
Yes, and just one of the example why there's not one of the most active group, but actually we are one of the most successful group. So where phishing emails could be easily detected by well configured anti-spam and anti-malware systems on analyzing your email traffic. But in most cases, actually, some of these spear phishing were labeled by the security systems as a malicious attachment, and then were delivered to a security team or IT team that is responsible for dealing with this sort of messages. And then, in one of the cases, actually, and it happens repeatedly, the IT staff forward these emails, for instance, to security guys with message in the body like, "Please take a look at this message. This is malicious attachment that we got recently. Please try to analyze it." But when a security guy received the email with attachment from a trusted internal employer, and it is IT guy, we don't read the body. They see attachment and quickly open the file that was attached to a message. They don't see any document, and only then they start to read what is actually written in the email, and then they understand that it was malicious. But again, the file was launched and the computer was infected. After that, of course, they do some basic actions like, okay, I opened some malicious attachment that is not detectable by my host antivirus solution. Let's do a full scan. If full scan doesn't indicate that the computer was infected, it means that there is no problem. But there is a problem, and actually this is how threat actors were able to quickly get access to security guy that has a lot of privileges in the corporate network. And another reason why we actually do not use decoy documents, when a simple user in the company, not a IT specialist, receives a mail with attachment but doesn't show you any content, so when you're trying to open this malicious file, it crashes. Then or shows you a message that you need to enable macros to see the content, but when the person enables macros, they don't see any content. Then this person will forward this malicious email to his neighbor just to check if this file will be successfully opened on a new computer, probably because the initial person who gets this email believes that there is something wrong with his Microsoft Office, for instance. And this is how the malicious document will be sent in the internal among users in the corporate network. And that's a big problem because it helps threat actors to infect more than one computer in the corporate network, and sometimes they get privileged access really fast.
It's also worth noting that a lot of this stuff kind of sounds stupid, but at the same time, it might seem that obviously less mature financial institutions are successfully targeted, which is the case. But we also do see from law enforcement investigations and looking at logs for like Cobalt strike, looking at connections to the CNCs that we then see, it's not just small financial institutions that are successfully targeted. It is also very large, very mature financial institutions who put tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars into their security per year. So it's sort of they are falling through the cracks to a certain degree. And so in order to identify some of their activity, there are a number of activities that they do conduct inside of corporate networks while they're persistent there, that security operation teams can then detect. So aside from the sort of the standard methodologies like Mimikatz, like exploiting group policy misconfigurations, they're also using a number of specific malware tools that are based off of the NSA leak from 2016. So that was related, Shadow Brokers leak. So Soft Perfect, Network Scanner, Eternal Blues, Eternal Punch. In addition to this, they also exploit, it's corporate antivirus. What's the specific file type, Dimitri?
MSZ.
Yeah. So they're also then exploiting malware provisioning and updating systems via corporate antivirus. It's a great system to use simply because it has good level of permissions throughout the network and is available everywhere. On top of that, they're also using a number of different methodologies for persistence. Aside from obviously creating different points of access and different CNCs, they're also creating services for auto-run keys, launching PowerShell, and basically redropping Cobalt Strike stages. On top of this, RDP access and then monitoring of activity on high-level computers. And by that, I mean computers that are, for example, responsible for ATM networks or card processing systems or Swift. And throughout attacks, obviously, they then develop new CNC servers, they add backdoors, create task schedulers in order to then basically redrop. I don't think we've seen any repeat incidents after an initial threat, as we have.
Yeah.
Didn't know.
So this is actually one of the reasons why you need external team to do incident response. So the last point is quite important. So we compromised the network. We successfully robbed the bank, but on one of the server we left a scheduled task that will, I would say, 3 weeks later, we'll go to external host and we will download new Cobalt Strike stager with a new C2 server that we never used by this group before. So we will use it as a backdoor. And we actually, when we analyzed logs from a copy of C2 server that we got in the end of last year, it was extremely interesting to see actually how companies that were successfully compromised and robbed took actions. I mean, security guys took actions to mitigate the incident, but their computer was at that moment under remote control, and they were able to screenshot and doing video files to monitor actually what security guys are doing in the corporate network, how we download new antivirus solution, how we read security articles, how we read actually our report about Cobalt Strike, how we deploy these new measures, how we order and download entire software from other security vendors to scan their entire corporate network. So
if you get compromised, don't rewatch this webinar in the corporate network.
Yes. Another interesting method used, but this cybercriminals are using, they're creating local account with name support 452. Sometimes they change some digits in the end of his nickname, but again, in most cases, the username will be the same, support 452. So if you see this is a local account, it highly indicates that you are successfully compromised. And of course, we provide Microsoft Remote Desktop Protocol permissions to be able to use this account to remotely connect to the host. Wait, we forgot to mention what we use actually for remote control, because not everything is quite simple. So in most cases, we use standard tools like VNC that is built into Cobalt Strike, some standard tools like radmin, madmin, and TeamViewer, depends on what region we're attacking, what tool is most popular in the region. Of course, we're using corporate RDP and VPN servers. We've seen that we use it quite often. But another tool that is quite unique, we're using Privot. It's a ReverseSOX for proxy.
It's available on GitHub.
Yep. Yes, it's a public tool, but again, we never saw that other cybercriminals use the same tool to conduct targeted attacks against financial institutions.
Yeah. So additionally, Cobalt have developed a number of other tools. So they reworked PagerApp into their own. It's not, by the way, related to NotPetya. So PagerApp's a redevelopment of the crypto locker Peter. But essentially the long and short of it here is that after they were unable to successfully steal from ATM, SWIFT, or card processing in a financial institution in Russia in the beginning of 2017, they then also used this corporate antivirus management software to then deploy this self-developed crypto locker across the entire network. It's not actually a crypto locker, so the email address that was related to it never received a response, and I don't think that there was any activity on the Bitcoin wallet, or it was even listed. So basically this was more of a message to the guys in the bank that successfully responded to Cobalt's activity that, well, okay, fine, we can't steal from you, but we can still cause you a lot of discomfort and a lot of problems. So we then were able to then, did we decrypt or did we restore from crash dumps on this particular IO?
Well, because the files were not successfully encrypted, so we encrypted only master root record. That's where all information was available on hard drive. But again, the bank has completely stopped the activity because all these computers were immediately became unavailable. We knew both actually the bank what they did to avoid further potential repeat of this type of incident. We bought new hard drives for every single computer, re-imaged them from a clean image with operating system, and then we copied some files that we restored from affected computers.
Subsequently, they've also been using various different recon backdoors and JS backdoors. These have been operational throughout 2017, so from I think May onwards. After I think there was some public reporting around Microsoft Word Intruder that came out in May of 2017. Subsequently, after that, Cobalt then began to develop their own recon backdoor. Following that, they also developed their own JS backdoor, and they've cycled through a range of different tools subsequently. The most recent dropper is Cobalt, I think we've been calling it, which is again basically a recon module that then has the capacity to then drop Cobalt strike beacon following initial reconnaissance on the victim computer. Dimitri, are there any points of interest you'd like to add on these slides? And I think we've overrun slightly, guys, so apologies for this.
Yeah, actually 2017 was a year when Cobalt started to invest a lot in developing new tools. And what is also worth to mention that sometimes we used newly created tool just a couple of times, and we stopped to use it was actually what happened with reconnaissance backdoor. So we created, we used it several times to attack some financial institutions in Russia and outside of Russia, and they stopped to support it, and we never seen it in next attacks. In case of JS backdoor, this is what actually we continue to use. The tools themselves are, well, now it's well described. It have very simple techniques to intercept proper information from the system. And as you see, some commands like we're able to download and execute files, can download new files, actually SCT script, it could be a new malicious module, of course execute it, and run some arbitrary commands. So everything is quite simple.
We've got a couple questions just while we're here. There are two more. So have we seen any Korean developers? No Korean based activity. That will show some additional stuff regarding Cobalt in Korea and a lack of a connection there based on some recent phishing emails that we've seen sent out at the end of May. Secondly, yes, this webinar is recorded as we detailed at the beginning. And finally, did we ever detect any collusion from staff of the organizations attacked? No, we did not. So there's never been any insight. At the scale that Cobalt is conducting their phishing campaigns at really precludes any inside, and also the international nature of that activity is just too far spread for there to be any inside. So also Cobalt doesn't sit in underground forums posting about what they're going to do. Very few really serious threat actors are using underground forums in any meaningful way at the current time. So if an intel vendor says, oh, you can get all of the information about criminal APT from underground forums, they either don't know what they're talking about or they're wrong.
Yes, and a quick comment about Korean developers. No, we never see any Korean developers, but recently we found new campaign related with use of Cobalt strike. It was done not by Cobalt gang, but looks like threat actors try to pretend to be a Cobalt gang. So at the moment we don't have enough information to provide you more technical details, but it will be uploaded into our portal within 2 days, I suppose.
Cool. Again, InfoStealer version 0.2 was used initially with basically through the period from mid-2017. Again, then dropped and then basically extracted. They're doing similar, basically, functionality across, well, similar end goals across all of these InfoStealers recon modules, and this is to understand what the victim network is, what additional information they can collect from it, and then is it a relevant target to then continue with the attack. Anything on this, Dimitri, or can we cruise ahead?
Well, yes, important thing to mention that we started to collect logins and passwords from mail clients, browsers, SSH, and FTP clients as well. We also collect data from address book, but is important because we need to improve their capabilities to deliver phishing to the financial institutions. And of course, when we infect companies' corporate email, corporate banking computer, we're able to get a lot of useful emails that is used by this user to communicate with other colleagues in other banks. And this tool is quite useful for them. And again, we following the trend, and we're also developing tools that are completely memory hosted, so we don't leave traces on a hard drive. And to bypass some of sandbox detection, we're trying to launch we're trying to implement delays about 10 minutes. So it means that if your sandbox launching files and for analysis only for 3 or maybe 5 minutes, it could be not detected if your sandbox is not well configured. So another also quick comments about actually the embedding new exploits in using the activity. This is what is also worth to mention. In November, company Embedi published a technical report about vulnerability. Then it was this vulnerability was patched, and this team published point of proof of concept on the GitHub. After just several hours, the Cobalt gang started to use this proof of concept to deliver malicious attachment to different companies on behalf of Swift Alliance. Later, some antivirus companies started to detect this spear phishing campaign, and just a few hours later, we adopted just newly created exploit and started to deliver to send new phishing mails that were unable to detect by most of antivirus solution. So we have on board a new member who is actually responsible for adopting new exploits, and he, I would say, provide premium support for them. And probably actually the guy who is doing that is the person with a nickname object that is responsible for creation Windows Microsoft Intruder.
Yeah, and additionally then in December of 2017, we saw this Java applet briefly used in order to then infect victim networks. So what they receive is a link. This then runs the Java application, which then drops the dropper. Not the most logical way of conducting attacks, and it was dropped quickly after initially being used. The reason is that just in terms of click-through, something as banal as that, more people click basically they click on attachments than click links. and accordingly, people also don't often run then Java updates. So the end result was that this was developed but then dropped pretty quickly just because it wasn't as effective as other methodologies. So basically, it had the capacity to screenshot, process information collection, drop the Cobalt strike beacon, but ultimately this was then dropped in favor of Cobalt, which is available in our full report on Cobalt strike activity that we've recently released. So we're kind of coming to the end of the webinar. Dimitri, is there anything you'd like to add? We'd like to run some Q&A just before then. So if anyone has any further questions, please put them into the chat, into the questions or the chat section now. Please don't be shy. I'm more than happy to talk for longer. We have overrun by about half an hour though. If not, we're going to continue with just saying on some recent Cobalt activity. In the meantime, all of this information is available to our clients in real time. There's significantly more than 50 updates on Cobalt, tracking their global activity in our threat intelligence portal. We track Cobalt along with a very broad range of other financially motivated and also nation state groups who target everyone from the telco sector, governments, through to financial services as well. This information is available in our threat intelligence portal. And as Dimitri described somewhat briefly earlier, is that we've also seen other incidents related to Cobalt relatively recently. So, for example, phishing on behalf of Apple that was being sent out, for example. We see their operations continuing. We provide recommendations. We give IOC. We track their infrastructure on a daily basis and then provide these updates to our clients as Stix taxi APIs to be consumed in tips or just in SIEM. We're also then covering other threats, like malware sales, Cutlet, pretty much the full gamut of threats that you'll see coming out of underground forums in the criminal underground. Finally, Dimitri, as we touched on somewhat earlier in the call, some interesting Korean activity with regard to threat actors masquerading as Cobalt. So if you'd like to touch on this briefly, and then we can finish off. Well, maybe we won't. I've just realized that we now have a hard finish in about a minute or two. But yeah, if anyone wants more information about this, we're very, very happy to reach out and share more. I'm available at any time, so please feel free to contact me at bobak@groupib.com, and we can give a free trial. We can answer any more Q&A that might be pending. And yeah, we look forward to continued communications. So thank you very much to everyone who's attended. We'll just see if there are any more Q&A that's come up in the past couple seconds, but no, there doesn't appear to be. So from me, Tim, thank you very much for all of your attention, to everyone who's taken the time to watch our webinar. I hope that it's been of interest and relevant, and yeah, look forward to being in touch further. Dimitri, anything to add?
Yes, just I would say thank you for all your attention spent with us, and hope to see you soon in our threat intelligence portal, asking more questions regarding every notification that we do about changing tactics of Cobalt Gang. Thanks a lot and have a nice day.
Thanks, guys. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you. So Dimitri and I will sit on for another couple minutes in case there are any questions direct that anyone wants to address. Yeah, please feel free to write to us in the questions panel or in the chat module. We'll be here for another 5 minutes or so, just making sure that just basically make sure that everyone has info, and we'll respond accordingly. All right, guys. Me and Dimitri are going to call it a day. Thank you very much, and we look forward to being in touch. Bye-bye.